Surly Dev has a topic. Alright, bring that back up. Go for it, Surly Dev. What's your topic? C# Fritz went offline. Oh, I probably missed my chance at a raid from him. Oh well. Let's see. Got through all my checklists. Close that. Let's tweet. Can't type. What's your topic, Surly Dev? If you're quick, I can add it to this tweet. Going live. Yeah. Right, yeah, that. What was your question about going live, though? That's confusing me. I went live, right? You said you are going live. Didn't I? I hit start streaming. You said you are going live. Didn't I? Yeah. But you are live. Aha! That was the confusion. Okay. Well, when I said it, I wasn't. Oh. Okay, fine. I'm streaming live. How about that? How about that? Is that better? Boom. Okay. Good enough. Alright, got a Twitter. I have projects. I haven't decided yet which project we're working on here. That's why I was vague in my thing, in my tweet. I think I still have some issues I want to work on with clean architecture. So we'll pick up where we left off last week, perhaps. But, what's your question, Surly Dev? You're talking about my weekly newsletter, which is at ardallas.com/tips. Here. Here. Add your email address. Somewhere there's a way to see the archive. I think. Publicly, maybe. Maybe not. Let's see, if I go over here, I go over here, and I copy this, here it is. Boom. So that's the tip we're talking about, and we'll throw that in there. There you go. Yeah, so we were talking about throwing away code, and how oftentimes when you have to throw away code either on purpose or accidentally, rewriting it takes less time and you end up happier with the result. Right? Hey, Code Stencil. Is this because you ruminate on the code in the back of your mind? And also, do you think that's why katas at user groups go so well? Well, they don't always go well. There's definitely times when they don't. I think they go well when you have people that know what they're doing there to help. Kind of coach the people that have never done it before. Yeah, exactly. They go well for the organizer if they've already practiced it a few times. But if you haven't, if you've never done a kata before and you decide you're going to do one at your workshop, your user group next week, and you never practice it, it's probably not going to go as well as you would like. But yeah, I think ruminating on the code in the back of your mind and in the front of your mind, I think having done it before informs your decisions that you make the next time. Hey, John Calloway, nice to see you. See the value of katas to get used to your tool set and language. Yeah, and also techniques and patterns, right? If you want to learn a design pattern, which is what I've been doing a lot of stuff with Pluralsight for. The reason I was late is because I was doing the last thing I need to do to get one of my design pattern courses out the door. Practicing a kata that shows you how to do a design pattern, how to apply a design pattern, do that 5 or 10 times, and you'll have a pretty good idea of how to apply that design pattern, as opposed to if you just read, the design patterns book that I've got laying around here somewhere, right? Like, boom, here's your design patterns book. Read this, okay? And then don't write any code. How good are you going to be at implementing those patterns? You're not. You're not going to know how to implement them at all, probably. because you've never done it, right? There's a big difference between doing it and just reading about it. All right. Also, because the organizer, right, afternoon, da-da-da, you think it's detrimental to new people. You think katas are detrimental to new people. Okay. Well, I think the thing that works well for me at my user group, where we do katas all the time, is that book was Design Patterns. That's the classic Gang of Four book, Design Patterns, that every developer should have on their bookshelf, even if they've never opened it, just so that people think you're a serious developer slash architect, right? So here, boom. Wow, it's not the top hit. There we go. Give me a link. Link. Give you a short link. This is an affiliate link, but you don't have to buy it from my affiliate link if you don't want to. But it does support the stream. But this is the book. You can get it in hardcover, which is what you need to have if you're going to stick it on your bookshelf. The better book, which folks are already mentioning, Surly Dev there, is Head First Design Patterns. This book, which I also, now it's upstairs, so I don't have it handy, but this book right here is really good for learning design patterns. So if you want to learn design patterns and have a book that is very different, we'll throw a link for this one out there too. And by different, I mean this does not read like your typical book that you would see. Let's look inside, right? This does not read like a typical software developer book, right? Once you get into the meat of the book, it's full of things that look like, well, kind of like this, right? Where they've got these little bubble boxes with funny pictures and lots of white space and diagrams and things like this, where the inserts of things. So it's really designed to like keep your brain moving around, to not put you to sleep. It's not just a wall of text like so many books. Even the source code that it has is like decorated with lots of graphics and things that kind of help you kind of really understand how it's going. So definitely recommend the Head First Design Patterns book. It's really good. Apparently you can rent it, which I suppose is probably only worthwhile if you're taking a course or something. And then also, shameless plug, Pluralsight has lots of design patterns topics out there, some of which I've written, some of which other folks have. But if you look at this patterns library, this is their kind of older design pattern library that a bunch of people, including myself, have contributed to. And so there's tons of patterns here. And then they have a newer design pattern. If you just do a search, they're like a design pattern learning path that you can find as well. So there's like design patterns in C# learning path that I'm working on. So there's a bunch of them here from, again, a bunch of different authors. None of these even have my name on them. Somewhere I swear I've got at least one of these. There's mine. So you can look at the adapter pattern. I've got a couple more that are coming that'll be in this learning path here real soon. So check that out as well if you want. So that's this learning path. Alright, let me catch up on chat. What's the book name? Got that. John Calloway just had lunch. Yay. Head First Design Patterns. Thanks. I'm working my way through your Pluralsight courses. Cool. Thanks, Surly Dev. We do a course on design patterns using .NET Core API. Well, most of these design patterns for C# are object-oriented design patterns. If you want to see design patterns for APIs, there's a free access for that. So just do a search for Cloud Design Patterns. And Microsoft has an ebook that you can get to here. So this whole chunk of table of contents here is actually this book. And there's a link somewhere where you can actually download the book. Where is it? Is it here? I don't know. Cloud Design Patterns. Cloud Design Patterns ebook PDF. Where's the PDF? Download the book. So yeah, just search for that, and here's the link. You can download this PDF, or you can just go. Nope, there it is. There, I just downloaded the PDF. So it looks like this, right? And it's 236 pages long, but it's also all online, right? So if you want to be able to hyperlink to it, just search for Cloud Design Patterns right here, and this is what they are. So you've got things like the cache aside pattern, right? Here's how the cache aside pattern works. I did a talk on some of these patterns at Stir Trek last year. Stir Trek would have been today, by the way, so it's kind of sad that we're not doing that conference today. But if you're looking for API-based design patterns that are separate from object-oriented design patterns at a higher level, I would start with this free resource from Microsoft, which is this Cloud Design Patterns ebook / these articles. This one, yeah, that's the one. Yep, okay. Yesterday I just learned proxy design pattern from your Pluralsight course. Thanks, Nibra. Glad to hear it. Imbra M, thanks for following. After watching your proxy design pattern course the other week, I realized I implemented this pattern in an app I did recently at work. Cool. Well, now you know it's got a name. That's one of the things I touch on as the benefit of design patterns is that they have names. So when you try to describe what you did to a coworker, instead of having to go through all the low-level things you did, you could say, oh, I applied the XYZ pattern. And assuming that they also know that pattern, then you just conveyed a whole lot of information at a high level. If they don't know the pattern, then you just confuse them, and they're either going to smile and nod and go Google it, or they're just going to stay confused. So it's useful if everybody knows the patterns. And the one course that I'm adding to this that isn't here yet is like a design pattern overview, and it talks about things like that. It talks about like why do you learn patterns and how should you learn patterns. Should you go and just go one by one and learn each pattern and get really good at it before you do the next one, or what? And so I talk about like what's the most efficient and effective way to kind of learn about design patterns in a way that'll be the most quickly beneficial to you. Because some of these patterns you might learn them and then you just never use them. So it's a good idea if you have a strategy for how you're going to learn them that's going to maximize your utility, right? Your ROI on that time. All right. So yeah, when I was reading your newsletter this week, I realized I should prototype a lot more and perhaps make throwing away that code a habit. Sure. I mean, I don't throw away a lot of code if I don't have to, but I do a lot of katas at user groups and things, and when I'm doing things like this, when I'm streaming or when I'm teaching, I'll pick something that I haven't done as often a lot of times and try and do it in a new way, right? Like maybe I haven't used LINQ recently, or maybe I'm just starting to learn it, or GraphQL is something I wrote about in a blog post last week. I haven't used GraphQL that much. I would definitely go and play around with doing some simple exercise or kata or whatever, create a to-do app using GraphQL before I would start using GraphQL in anger at a client or on my own even production code, right? So you can use katas as a way to write code that you're basically throwing away, to practice, right? And to build habits. But yeah, the idea with this was, be okay with throwing stuff away and rewriting it, because the rewrite's probably going to get done in a fraction of the time that it took to do it the first time, and it's going to be better. Now that applies to like relatively small amounts of code, right? I mean, if you're Twitter, you aren't just going to decide like, hey, let's throw away our entire code base and let's rewrite Twitter from the ground up, on a whim. Now, that said, they did have to rewrite probably more than once now, their initial way of doing things, because it didn't scale to the levels that it needs to today. So, yeah, sometimes you do, for architecture reasons, need to just do a rewrite. But I wouldn't recommend, like, every month just throwing away your whole project and rewriting it, because, at some point it's going to be difficult for you to get much more done that way, I've been letting perfect get in the way of being good enough, and it's slowing me down. Yeah, that's a common problem. Perfect is the enemy of good. So that's you need to just ship it and then be okay with fixing it and refactoring it if you need to. So ship it, but don't ship crappy code. Just ship code that is good enough and that you can fix later, right? Like, not I'll just fix it later, like you're just being lazy, or later never comes. But code that is clean and testable and ideally tested, right, is easy to change later. So you put in a little bit of upfront work to send code that isn't perfect but is malleable to production sooner, and then you get feedback faster. And things you might learn from feedback would be, I built the thing wrong. It's got bugs. I better fix those. Or I built the wrong thing. Right? Customers aren't using it, or customers are confused why it exists, or whatever. Users don't expect it to do what I thought they were going to do. And so that's important too. Like maybe you need to just throw the thing away. It wasn't the right thing to build. And if you had spent an extra 3 weeks making it perfect and perform super well, only to ship the wrong thing 3 weeks later, those 3 weeks are all totally wasted because you aren't going to use that thing anyway. In a big enterprise project, we'll separate common utils and libraries. Do you have any samples for that? Yeah, sure. I would say the shared kernel is the thing that I use for that. If you're using domain-driven design, that's what it's called. NuGet packages are what you want to use for that typically, whether you're calling it a shared kernel or not. I'm a big fan of taking your common utilities and libraries and not sharing them by copy pasting, not sharing them by including the same project in multiple different solutions, which is another common thing. But instead, take them and put them into a NuGet package, assuming you're on .NET, which let's just assume you are, and using that local NuGet package. The thing about NuGet packages, let's just open up Visual Studio here real quick. And what's a NuGet package I've got? API endpoints, right? This is a NuGet package. So I can publish this locally if I want, right? You can create a NuGet package server, a NuGet source server, just by using a file share if you need to. So don't feel like you have to install a bunch of stuff to be able to use NuGet internally. Now, if you're using Azure DevOps or you're using GitHub or using tools like MyGet, it's really easy to have a real full-featured NuGet server. But let's say you're a small company, you don't have any of that stuff, and Steve said, hey, you should use a NuGet packages to share stuff, right? Well, let's take this thing and let's just publish it. And I can publish it somewhere, right? So we'll just publish it straight to there. That's fine. Create a profile, do it, and then let's go find this thing. Bin, debug, net standard, there's all that, and did it publish it? Where did it publish it to? Publish, bin, release, net standard, publish. I'm looking for it here. Bin, release is not even there. Did I have to hit the publish button? Is that what I thought right clicking would do it, but I guess no, I have to do that. Alright, fine. So now, bin, release, there we go. There, publish, boom. So there's my nupkeg file, right? So I can take that, and let's pretend I've got a file share on here. I don't, right? But I can create one right now. I'll call this local NuGet. And we'll come in here and we'll just create a folder called ardalis.api endpoints. Now this folder's totally optional, but we'll drop this in here. Okay. Now I can come in to some project. Like let's do DevBetterWeb. DevBetterWeb's not using API endpoints yet. So let's say this is one of several solutions that I have at my company. And right now, the way I share stuff is I just copy paste it in between. But I really want to be able to have support for versioning and things like that. Well, I can come in here and I can say manage NuGet packages. And normally it's going to go to NuGet.org, right? But I can say, you know what? No, I want to point this at a different NuGet package source. So I'm going to say add this new package source. I'm going to call it local NuGet. This could be your company, right? This could be Acme NuGet packages, right? Whatever your company name is. And here, this looks like a web URL, but it doesn't have to be. So this could be c:\/ local NuGet, assuming that's what I called it. Yep. It could also be // file share / NuGet, right? So if you've got an intranet with a file share, like most folks that are running Active Directory and have an actual network, then this works just fine, right? And you just drop stuff in there. You can have your build server automatically drop stuff in there. You don't have to host any software. But if we go back to there and say OK, now I'm going to say this is my source, is local NuGet, and there it is, right? And I can install it from there. I can do whatever I want from there. You see there's only one version of it. If I come over here and I say, well, let's rev this, let's make 0.5, and then we'll just publish it here. Now that I know how to do this, hit the button. I can come back to my other one, and probably have to hit it again or something for it to see it. Let's do manage NuGet packages here, and it says there's still only one. Oh, I didn't copy it. That's my fault. That's the local NuGet. Look over here. Open in File Explorer. I didn't actually push it to the NuGet package. So there's that one there. Drop that in there. Go back to there, and I don't know how. Oh, there's the refresh button. There we go. Boom. Now it works. All right. So this, to answer your question in a roundabout way, common utils and libraries should go in NuGet packages. Those NuGet packages should go in a private NuGet package source that your company has access to, and your applications that need those things should reference those NuGet packages. Now, what happens if I'm perfectly happy on 0.94, I install that, and I need to ship today, right? I want to publish Dev Better Web right now. I can publish it with 0.94, even if the team down the hall or in the next state or wherever, just publish breaking changes to that shared utility, and they put it in 0.95. I'm not taking 0.95 yet because I got to go to production today. Later on, when I get around to it, I can pull in 0.95 and I can deal with those breaking changes. But I can do it when I feel like it, not when they broke me. So that's one of the big benefits. If you've got Azure DevOps, why not just publish to Azure Artifacts? Yes, certainly. I'm just pointing out that you don't need all that. So yeah, if you've got Azure DevOps, just use Azure DevOps. It's got a NuGet feed there. GitHub does too. TeamCity does too. Whatever tool you're using as your build server probably has some support for also acting as a NuGet source. So use one of those if that is what makes sense. If you don't have all that stuff, you can get by with just the file share. Yeah, okay. Good enough to ensure it fits the how, yes, if it gives user a different way than how you expect. I'm guessing if you have an Azure DevOps repro for that solution, you could have the pipeline build test and publish that to your internal share and you get yes, definitely. So part of your build stuff, let's go back here, let's look at, say, guard clauses, because I have Azure Pipelines set up for that. So let's look at Azure Pipelines, and if you want to see this yourself, either now or later, here's the URL. But basically, this is using Azure DevOps for free, right? Because this is an open source project. So if you just want to play around with Azure DevOps, create an open source anything on GitHub, and just add this Azure Pipeline stuff to it. When you create a new repo, it'll ask you. Right? If I say new repository down here, it says, hey, do you want to use Azure Pipelines? And you check the block, and it just does it. I think the first time to get this to work, I had to go in the marketplace and add it. But after that, it's just there every time. Okay, so in here you've got this YAML file, and you can configure all these things like what are your triggers, do you want to use a Windows image to build it, or Linux, etc. Let's make this a little bigger for you. And so one of the things I'm doing in here is just installing all the things I need to build this thing. So in this case, I just want to make sure I have the right version of .NET and NuGet and stuff like that. And then I'm building it and running tests and running code coverage and stuff. But then here, this publish artifact is where I'm actually publishing this thing out. And so you can configure this stuff here and you can see right here I'm copying my Nupcake file because this is a NuGet package. You can configure this so that it will do the right thing for your system. So when the build passes and all the tests succeed, then we will go ahead and publish this. You can also see that for this guard clauses project, if we go out to the root of it, you can click right here on this Azure Pipelines badge. These are all clickable. And from here you'll be able to see, like, notice I'm not signed in, so this is all visible to anybody. You can see what the pipeline looks like. You can see what the artifacts look like. So here's a summary of this last build. You can see the tests. There's 207 tests. They all passed. You can see the code coverage. You can come in here and drill down and see, which things are or are not covered. It's all pretty nice. And then under releases, you can see when it's done a push to NuGet.org. So here I just did a 1.5 release to NuGet.org a few days ago. And so you can configure build pipelines and release pipelines. You can also, as John was mentioning, just use this for your artifacts for your package source. So I'm not doing that because this is a public GitHub, a public NuGet package. So it's actually going out to NuGet.org here. So there's our Dallas.guard clauses, which says 0 downloads, even though it has been out there for 3 days. So that's probably wrong. Sometimes this takes a while to update, but maybe nobody's using it now. But anyway, this is where that got published to. But you can, if you want, publish it right here into your Azure DevOps artifacts and then just use that internally. All right, let's catch up some more. When are you next recording episodes of the podcast? For John Calloway's Six Figure Dev podcast, I'm guessing. Monday at 6 p.m. with Cecil Phillips talking about Python. They have an Azure Pipeline Client UI. Yeah, I think we looked through that, Nibro. Not yet. Task Clayton with adding a schedule. You can keep him from tinkering audio settings. So all your setups you have defined in your YAML file. Yes. So these pipelines here, if I were logged in, I'd be able to edit this pipeline. And there's a GUI for it, right? So you can go through the GUI, or you can just edit everything in the YAML file. And I recommend getting comfortable with the YAML file, because the really nice thing about this YAML file is that you can totally copy-paste this thing, right? So if you want to get started with how to build a NuGet package, just rip this thing off, copy-paste it, right? It's free. It'll work for your NuGet package, assuming it's mostly the same as this. If you look at this code and you look at it closely, you're not going to see guard clauses in there anywhere. Or if there is, it's going to be like in one place. Let's search guard clauses. Like, it's only in there twice, and it's right here, right? There's nothing in this script that's specific to this project. And if you architect your YAML files properly, that should always be the case, right? Or if they do have to have specific stuff about the name, they should be confined to these variables. Right? If you need to know the solution name or the project name or things like that, put them in variables here so they're not in the body of it. And then it's really easy to reuse. You just tweak the variables if you need to, and you're done. All right. So that's all to answer the question, how do you share common libraries in your organization, I guess. All right, so let's jump back to a different project now. I want to pick up where we left off last week. So we're going to go look at this clean architecture repository here and see what issues were remaining. Some of them were just documentation things, and I think I took care of some of them. And maybe we'll do some of that documentation just so you can see what some of that looks like. Because there's been a few good Twitter conversations in the last couple weeks talking about how to do architecture diagrams. So maybe we could look at that. Like I've got this sequence diagram here that kind of shows, blow this up a little bigger, what happens when you hit an endpoint to mark this to-do item complete, and it kind of walks through all the steps so you can see it. I think that would be probably a good thing to get into the README file. It's not there yet. It's just in this this issue. But I can also kind of walk through, how I built this diagram, which I think some of you might find useful. So Surly Dev's heading to dinner. He'll be back. All right. Have fun. Stay safe. Social distancing and all that. Nibra, I've never worked on Azure Pipeline for CI/CD, but certainly going to work on it. Mostly worked with TeamCity. I love TeamCity. TeamCity's great. The only thing I don't like about TeamCity is they don't have a hosted version. So you have to maintain a VM somewhere that actually runs it. If they ever have a hosted TeamCity, I'd probably be all over it. But I fear that ship may have sailed. And what I'm using most nowadays is GitHub Actions for that kind of thing. John says he's adopted Clean Architecture solution and is really liking it. Cool. Thanks. All right, so let's work on putting this into the README file so people can see it, and also kind of talking through this. And we'll look at where can you build these things. So I have There's a few ways you can build these types of diagrams, but my favorite at the moment is PlantUML and planttext.com. So PlantUML has like the spec of all the things you can do, and then planttext.com is where you can just play with this stuff in your browser. So here's the diagram that I just copy pasted out, and this is that diagram, right? You just saw it there. And so if I want to change some of this, I can just edit this text here and adjust it. For now, I think it's actually pretty good. So I'm just going to copy this image and jump back to my blog here, and we're going to edit the README file, and we'll just edit it right here in the browser. The editing tools for GitHub in the browser are actually pretty decent. I mean, if you're comfortable with Markdown. So actually, before I do that, let's just preview it for a second. Where should I put this? So here's the template, there's the thing, there's the GitHub, there's the goals, there's design decisions. I should probably just have a whole section on how domain events work. So where would that go? Design decisions and dependencies. I'm going to need a table of contents for this thing pretty soon. Let's have a patterns section at the bottom, and under patterns we'll talk about domain events. Eventually this thing's going to be a book that's going to rival my eShop on Web book if I keep going this path. But let's just go here. Let's just jump to the bottom. I think we'll use a single hash and say patterns used, and we'll say this solution template has code built in to support a few common patterns, especially domain-driven design patterns. Here is a brief overview of how a few of them work. Alright, so let's talk about domain events. Okay, we'll say domain events are a great pattern for decoupling a trigger for an operation from its implementation. This is especially useful from within domain entities, since the handlers of the events can have dependencies while the entities themselves typically do not. In the sample, you can see this in action with the to-do item dot complete. I don't even know if that's what it's called. Do I still have Visual Studio up? Yes, but not for that. Let's open up. Well, let's just close this. And we'll close this. And we'll open this. And we'll find clean architecture right there. And we'll go look at that to-do item here, which I called mark complete. So mark complete method. Mark complete method. The following sequence diagram demonstrates how the event and its handler are used when an item is marked complete through a web API endpoint. Alright, now I have still, hopefully in my clipboard, the image. So if I just paste it here, it didn't work. But there's a good trick, which is if you go back to that issue, open in another tab, come over here and come look at this and view this link. Like, there's the image on GitHub, so I can just copy that and then come back over here and just paste this in here. We'll call this a domain event sequence diagram, and let's say that's good enough for now. Let's see what that looks like. Alright, so now if we scroll down to the bottom of this thing, you say, look, here's this new patterns used section with domain events, blah blah blah, and here's to-do item mark complete, and there's the call to mark complete right there, and what happens, right? Alright, so for those of you that are here, the other thing I want to do is probably do like a YouTube walkthrough of this at some point that shows this. So here's what that would look like. Not that, I already have this one. Alright, so I think, I was playing around with this earlier, I think I might have broken it. Let's see if it still works. I might have to reset it to the source. Alright, let's make sure we can do a pull. Get my latest, let's check out our changes and abandon them if there. Oh wow, there's changes everywhere. Yeah, let me just drop down to PowerShell real quick. 18 changes that I don't want. Bam. Alright, that's better. Alright, now let's verify we can still build. And let's run it. Alright, so I'm going to go put a... Let's hit this to-do items controller. There's this complete endpoint. That's what that sequence diagram is showing. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here so you can see how this works. So in the sequence diagram here, we're saying that we hit this mark complete endpoint. It calls get by ID on the repository, gets back an entity, then it calls mark complete on the entity, which records this event. Then it calls update from the endpoint to the repository again. The repository calls save changes, which hits the DB context, and that dispatches the event. Alright, well, what's the event? Well, over here, I have this handler right here, and it's got a breakpoint already. Now this thing doesn't do anything, but this handler ostensibly would be to send an email notification. Yeah, it's not doing that, but that's what it would do. So let's come back here. Let's close all the other documents. Well, I didn't want to close that one, but that's fine. So here we are. This is what we're going to hit. So I'm going to F5. We'll drive this thing. And when you copy this thing yourself and run it, you should be able to just immediately do the same thing. Just hit F5. If you go to the API documentation, well, first let's show you what's there. So when it runs, it populates the to-do items with these 3 items. So that's what's there in the data. So if we hit the API documentation, here's those items. This patch call right here, this is that mark complete call we're going to test. So we can do a get here and try it out. If you haven't used Swagger, it's really nice. Here's the actual data that we've got. So there's ID 1, 2, and 3. Notice that none of them, actually ID 1 is true. Actually, I marked that true earlier today. So 2 and 3 are both false. So we can call 2 and 3. In fact, because of a bug, you could actually mark 1 complete again if you wanted to. So we could probably fix that bug. But alright, so let's try 2. So we're going to try out mark complete. We're going to hit 2. We're going to execute. And we're going to hit our breakpoint. So in our breakpoint, we're fetching the thing from persistence. So we'll step over that. We can mouse over to do item. And in the debugger, you can see here's the text of it. Here's its ID 2. Here's the title. And you saw, if you look there, that it was mark complete is done false. Alright, now we're going to call mark complete. Step over that. Now, what did that do to to-do item? Let's look at it down here. Is done is now true, right? You can also see events has a count of 1. So what we did is we recorded an event. We didn't actually dispatch it yet. So there's 2 concepts happening right here. We're using events, but we're not immediately triggering them. We're not immediately sending them off. The reason for that, and thanks for the follow, Apple XO. The reason for that is because I want to make sure before I send an email notification to tell someone something happened, like that they bought this item from me, that I actually save that. And so these things get queued up in a list until we are able to save the entity successfully. And after we have saved the entity, then we will trigger the events. Now, an interesting thing somebody asked last week was, well, isn't there a bug? Because if I delete the entity and it had events, they never get fired. And he's right. I mean, that is actually that behavior. But I think if you delete the item, you probably don't want the events to fire off anyway. And we'll see why in just a second. Because typically the event includes a reference to the item. And if you've deleted the item, your event handlers are probably going to blow up anyway, or they're not going to know what to do because they're going to try and handle an event on an entity that doesn't exist. Thanks for the following Deutsch performance. All right, so now here we're going to do a repository update. Let's step into that so we can see what that does. Here's my repository. It's an EF repository. It's totally generic. And we're going to call update async. So all this thing does is verify this thing's state is modified and then calls dbcontext save changes. So we'll step into this. Normally, you don't care what save changes does. And I'll get to your question in just a second, Nibro. But in this case, we're using a modified version of save changes. So this is my app dbcontext, which inherits from Entity Framework's dbcontext, right? This is my specific version of it. And so in my save changes async, I'm calling base save changes. So that's what's going to actually save to the data store. All right, so we'll step. My int result here is 1. I changed 1 record. That's success. So since I got success, it continues on. If it was going to fail, it was going to throw an exception, right? If the database wasn't there, or there's a primary key or foreign key constraint or whatever, it would blow up. So I would never get here. So assuming that it was successful, we continue on. And now we're going to get all the entities that have events that we're tracking. And then we're going to go through and we're going to get all the events from those. So in here we go and we get all the events. So now if we look at events down here, you see it has 1 event in it. And then we're going to loop over those and we're going to dispatch them. So we have 1 event, we're going to dispatch it, and it's going to go right here. And that dispatch would call any number of handlers, right? Not just 1. So in this case, we only have 1 handler, and it's going to do this work, which really is nothing. But in a real system, this would be like, I'm going to send an email, right? Now this sending of email is happening, in this case, it's happening in, what's the word I want? Not in parallel, in serial, right? In line with this, in the same thread. But if you wanted to, you could just be queuing up a message here, right? And then some other process could send the email. The point is that the trigger of sending the email has occurred, and this handler is responsible for that. Okay, so then this continues and completes, and that completes, and that completes. And now we're done dispatching, and now we're done with save changes. And at the end of all that, we're back in our controller. There's the repo. There's the controller, right? So now we're in our controller action again. And we have done the work, completed the thing, and all the follow-on activities that triggered because we completed that to-do item also have happened, right? And so now I can just return my result, whatever that happens to be. All right, so what's interesting about that to me, from a pattern perspective, and coming back around to Nibro's question, let me just read it. So here your controller directly connects with the repository. Is it fine, or should we have some service or controller connect with a service and the service connects with the repository? And it's a good question. It's a very common question. What I don't like to see in my controllers is a different layer of abstraction. So I am fine with controllers that only have a repository and that work with the domain model directly, or that only do CRUD. And so all they're doing is inserts and updates and whatnot, and that's fine. Right? Now this one's a little different because it has all the CRUD methods, but then it also has this method here, which is kind of like a remote procedure call almost, because it's doing an actual execution of a method on an item. And we could talk about the pros and cons of that design decision separately. It's just here as a demo. But I'm fine with using repository from controller when the thing you're working with is at the layer of abstraction of your domain model, right? I'm going to get my domain model, in this case this to-do item entity, I'm going to work with my domain model, and then I'm going to save the changes when I'm done. This pattern, this very simple pattern, works great. If that's not good enough, if I need a service, if I need a domain service or an application service or something to do the work, what I don't want to see, let me stop debugging here so we can look. What I don't want to see is that this controller takes in a repository and also this domain service, right? And also an application service, because now that controller is working at different layers of abstraction. It's dealing with a service layer, and it's dealing with a persistence layer, repository layer. All right. So that would be a concern. The other reason, the most common reason why folks end up going to these services is because they're not using domain events, and they don't have any other way to do it. All right, so let me show you what that looks like. And Hard Denmark likes to use Mediator. I do too. I've got a bunch of articles on Mediator, and my most recent version is that API endpoints thing I just showed you that doesn't even need it. Doesn't even need Mediator. In fact, we'll look at that. Let's look at that right here. So this is using API endpoints, right? And so instead of using a controller with different actions, think of this like this is the handler for your Mediator command. Only instead of having to have Mediator, my command is just this to-do item request. It's right here. A new to-do item request comes in with just the title and the description. And under create, it's going to go in here. It's going to create the item. It's going to call a repository to add it, and it's going to return OK. So this is exactly what I would have put inside of a Mediator command handler, but I don't have to use Mediator. I used to use Mediator a lot, but now I don't have to because I use the API endpoint pattern, which is just a request endpoint response, or REPR, like Reaper. Okay, so then now what does a delete look like? Well, it's the same thing, right? This is just an endpoint, right? So if I were doing this with Mediator, I'd have to have a controller involved, and every action would have to say create this command and call mediator.send. And I've got code for what that looks like out here. Ardalis Mediator controllers, moving from there to there. Right. Hey, that one came up fast. We'll paste that in there. Hey Vhons, thanks. And thanks for the follow, Hard Denmark, if I didn't say that already. So in here you can see what the Mediator code looks like. In this case it's using movies instead of whatever, but this first example is without Mediator. How would you do this? Right, so here's a controller, it's got a repository, it creates the thing, returns OK. Great. Okay, now let's add Mediator. Well, now look at this example. Right? It no longer needs a repository in the controller. It only needs Mediator. And inside of the action method, forgive the and LT semicolon junk in there, that's just the formatting of my code editor. Inside there now it just creates a new movie command and sends it. Right, so that's a little nicer. What you're not seeing here is that there's still a handler somewhere that does the actual work, and that's this. Right, so you have to have the controller still with the action. The action now has to package up a command and send it for Mediator, and then you have this handler that does just the work of actually creating the movie. Okay, now if you want to go even further, you can use model binding. So model binding, what you see right here, allows you to say, I'm not going to have to do the mapping to the command separately. See ya, John. Have a good weekend. Instead of having to do the creation of the command, which I'm doing up here, right here I'm creating the command, and I'm having to take the DTO that I get, and I'm having to translate it into a command so I can send that to Mediator. Right? Over here now, I'm just going to say, you know what, model binding will do that for me. I'll just take in the command as my model that the API expects, and then I'll send that. Right, so now this gets a little simpler. I still have to pass in Mediator though, so I can get that even better if I say, you know what, I'm going to have this base API controller, and the base API controller is going to have this Mediator property, and I'll configure that with property injection to always be set up whenever ASP.NET Core creates that controller for me. And so now my controller looks pretty small, right? I just take this thing and I just send that command. I still have to have all those handlers though, right? I still have to have this handler actually has to do the work of you know, handling that command and taking care of the Mediator stuff. Okay, so why do I still need to have all these actions that have the same two lines over and over again to do that work when I could just get rid of that and instead just have an endpoint that does the work? And that's what this thing has at the end of it is hey, go look at the endpoints. I think I probably need to add a link on here somewhere, like a more prominent link. I don't think I see one, so maybe I need to add that. But once you go the API endpoint route, you don't need Mediator anymore, right? Like I was just talking about create. Like this is exactly what was in that handler that Mediator was calling, but now I don't need Mediator. Instead, I need Ardalis.endpoints, and I don't need a controller. I don't need a controller. I don't need an action. I don't need Mediator. All I need is an endpoint. And when I have an endpoint, I tell it I'm expecting this, I'm returning that. Here's my handle method, right? It's async or not, and it does all the work, right? So I can do my work right here. Okay, so that's a quick segue on Mediator, right? Let's go back to the question about, do I need a service? Right, because that's a good question. It's a super common question. Let's say we're not doing anything with domain events. Right, we're going to come into to-do item. We're going to get rid of, in fact, we're going to get rid of this whole thing. There is no mark complete method. All right, we've got a to-do item. It's got an is done. You can set it anywhere you want. Here in to-do controller, we're going to say, when we say complete, what we actually do is we say is done equals true. All right, and we're done, right? We should be able to still build. Now, you have a requirement that says when, and that's not going to be happy. That's fine, we'll just comment those out. Your requirement says when someone marks a to-do item as complete, someone needs to get an email. All right. So let's implement that real quick with an interface. So we'll come up here and we'll say add a new folder, interfaces, and we'll come in here and we'll say add a new item. I'm going to call it a class, but it's really going to be an interface. And it's going to be email sender, like that. And this interface is going to be public, because otherwise it's useless. And it's going to say void send email, string to, string from, string subject, string body. Alright. And that's that. And then we're going to implement that over here. We'll have a new class. Add a class. We'll call this email sender. And we'll make it public. And we'll say it implements email sender with an actual colon. That's neat. Even without the colon, it brought in a namespace. And then we'll implement the interface. And we're going to say this thing needs a logger. I think a logger of email sender logger, and we'll do that. And we're not actually going to send an email. We're going to say logger.log. We'll say warning, so it pops out at us. Sending email to, and $that to from with subject. Good enough. I don't care about the body. Right? Build that. Okay. So now we have a way to send email. All right. So now I'm going to come back to where's my API? To-do items controller. I'm going to pin that. Okay. So requirement comes in. We need to send an email whenever somebody does this. Okay. Bam. I know what to do. I'm going to come right here. I'm going to say send email. That's my placeholder. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to say I need a service. I send email. That's my service. No, it's not it. It's email sender. Oop, delete that. Too quick with the control dot. Email sender control dot that. Thank you. Email sender control dot and that. Okay, so now I've got an email sender. Why is email sender under core, not infrastructure? Because it's an abstraction, and your abstractions, your interfaces should all go in core, or if they're shared, they could go in shared kernel. The shared kernel project you see over here on the right should be a NuGet package. So it's in the solution for the solution template, but when you do this for real, you'd want to pull that out into a separate NuGet package. All right. The implementation for the abstraction goes in infrastructure, because normally it's going to have dependencies on actual infrastructure like SendGrid or local SMTP server or something like that. Okay, so I've got an email sender in my controller, and I can come in here and I can say, okay, email sender dot send email to, something, let's just to from item completed details. Right? There's that. Okay. Folks that are watching this intently, paying attention, All right, here's your quiz. Pay attention. Tell me, somebody, what's wrong with this code. There's probably several things wrong with this code, but what would you change about this code? First off, I'm going to give you a free one. I don't need this comment anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that comment. So, what else? Crickets. I don't know if there's a lot of delay or not between me saying stuff and you guys typing it. Anybody? Await on send. Yes, sure. This should be async, right? So I was lazy when I made my interface. This should be an async call. Fine, that's right. Tony says SRP violation. What's the responsibility that we should have? Right? I mean, it's doing all the work of when we complete this thing, all the things. V. Honez, he got the one I was looking for. Thank you. So VHone says the item has not been saved yet, right? What happens if I send this email, and imagine that this is not just a to-do item being checked off. Let's say this is something more important, like your insurance policy was approved, your bank loan was approved, your shopping cart was checked out, right? Here, I'm going to send an email to you saying, hey, congratulations, you just got your mortgage for your house or whatever. Go to the bank, go do your thing. But then this line blows up and bad things happen. The database was down for a second. Now, guess what? The email already went out, but your system has no idea that happened. And that's a bad place to be, because now the customer has an expectation and you have no idea, unless you have a lot of good logging and recovery, that ever happened. Okay, so that's the biggest one. So we can fix that by just taking our thing that should be async and putting it right here, right? But now we come to the other issues, SRP, right? What's this controller's job? This controller's job is to basically just marshal between the web, the HTTP UI side of things, and our domain model, right? And now we're doing work with our domain model, but we're also doing business logic, right? Sending emails when something gets completed, that's a business rule. Like, that doesn't belong in our UI project at all. Why is it here? And so the first thought you should be, you know what, we might mark this to-do item done anywhere, right? I could mark that done anywhere in this application. It's just a public setter. And so there's nothing to enforce this rule that it would be done from everywhere, like every time something happens. Yeah, and temporal coupling, that's related to whether it's been saved. Also the fact that this email is going to happen right now is another issue, right? It could be somewhere else, right? It could be that we don't actually send the email right now. Maybe we're just creating a message in a queue that goes to some other process that sends the email later. Those are all architectural decisions that we could choose by virtue of the fact that we have an abstraction, right? Like, yay for us, at least we created an abstraction for email sender, which could now be implemented in any number of ways. If we didn't do that, right, if we were really evil, or naive if you prefer, we could have just been in here and said, like, hey, system.mail or system.net.smtp client, right? Just pull this thing in here, or whatever it is. SMTP that. Give me that. I don't know. There's a system.net.smtp client that you can use. I'm just getting the syntax wrong. But if we hard-coded that right here, then we'd be in big trouble. Okay, save the update with the status of approved or pending or something, and then after the email is sent, change it to confirmed. I'm okay with the fact that email already has options for retry, right? If I send the email and I get back a success status from my email server or from SendGrid or from whoever, it's got logic built into that process for retrying. So I'm okay that my responsibility to send the email is done at that point. The only way I can be really sure that they got the email is if they click a link in it that comes back to a confirmation URL on my side. And I can't guarantee, even if they got it, that they're going to click that link. So there's only so much I can do to be sure that the email was sent. If this thing doesn't give me an error, I'm going to assume it worked. All right, but what I want to make sure of is that it doesn't do this before it does this, because if this thing does an error, there's no way for me to undo sending the email. All right, there's plenty of ways I could undo the database update if I needed to. I have control over that. Okay, but now you guys did a good job. You found all the stuff I was looking for. But this doesn't really belong here, right? And we want to make sure that this and this are tied together somehow. So yeah, the next thing you might do is say, I should introduce a service, right? A service would be a better place for this because then I don't have these two different levels of abstraction here. Well, I guess they're both low levels of abstraction. So yeah, so let's just say we're going to do a service. We're only going to do a service for this bit of code, right? So let's just put it here. We're going to say I have a public class to do service. Am I capitalizing do? I guess I am. So we'll call it to do with a capital D service. And it's going to have a public void mark complete method. And it's going to just take in an ID, right? That's all it needs. We can look it up. Okay. Now this thing can have a constructor. And its constructor can look an awful lot like this constructor. Right, so we'll paste this in right there actually, and just rename the constructor. Wouldn't it be great if constructor was just a keyword? You just say public constructor, and then when you copy it around, you don't have to rename it like I just did. That would be so cool, but that's not going to happen. Thanks for the follow, Alan Ritchie. Okay, so now I've got this service. Now I can just take this work, basically, and copy it and paste it in here. And there you go. And then in here, now instead of all this, this thing can just take a to-do service, and we can have an interface for it as well. So we'll just say that, well, I'm going to change that in a second, but let's just take to-do service as is for now. So we'll come up here. We're not going to need email sender anymore, so let's just get rid of that. To-do service, control dot, underscore thing. All right, get rid of the email sender that we're not using. And then down here, we just call underscore to do service dot mark complete with the ID. All right. Now the problem is this thing wants that to do item, so I really need to return our result equals that, and this thing needs to return back a to do item there, and it should probably be a async task of to do item there, and then when it's done, it just needs to return that so the controller gets it. Return to do item, right? And then everything's pretty happy. I'll just call that result. Throw a carriage return in there. Cannot convert from, oh yeah, we gotta await on that. Now it's all happy. All right. So, okay, so this theoretically should still work, at least build. If it builds, that means it works, right? Okay, so now we're in here, we got this service. And this thing calls it, and this thing sends the email. Are we good? Are we happy? What's wrong with this? So SurlyDev says, in this, you're still relying on the UI to call the service to both update the status, wait for success, and then send the confirmation email. Yeah, the service now encapsulates all the responsibility of what to do when you mark this thing complete, which is great. And now we have the thing I mentioned earlier that I don't really like is we have two different levels of abstraction in our controller. Our controller some of the time talks to a repository and some of the time talks to a service. And what are developers going to do when they see that and they want to fix it is they're going to take all the other actions that are on this controller and they're going to put them on the service so that they can get rid of the other thing. So, they're going to say, you know what, I need a list and a get by ID and a create, and then we're good to go. So they would come in here and they would basically I'm just going to copy paste the code. They would basically just do this list like that, and they would drop that into the service like this, and then they would HTTPify it like this, and instead of a task of action result, it would be a task of a list of to do item list, and it would return just the items like that, and public async task of what's wrong with this? Must not like somewhere I've got a curly bracket that I pasted poorly. That's all good. Expected. Oh, I see. Missing an angle bracket. Bam. Okay. That. Alright, so that works. This can go away and it becomes get by ID, and this just returns return item. Let's return items. This already had the await. Why is it a list of, oh, because I did that. That should be item. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Ninja Job. Still not happy. That should be to-do item. Alright, and this just probably needs a .to list on it now. Which maybe isn't efficient, but should get close. To-do item DT, oh, right, it should be a DTO. To-do item, fine. DTO. Bam. Now, did I need the to-do list? The to list? Yeah, because it's enumerable. It's fine, I can just do this. enumerable. Yeah, that's better anyway. Alright, and this is the same deal. This is that. This needs to be a to-do item DTO. And then this one, lastly, would be our create. And from a DTO, we're going to create this thing like that. And it's going to be a task of to do item DTO. And do that. Alright, so all that so that we could do that service, right? And folks that follow a rule that says, hey, we don't want to use repositories, we want to just use services, this will look familiar to. So you'll come here, and you'll get rid of this, and you get rid of this, and then all these just become pass-through, where you just say, you know, var items equal await, and now this just becomes underscore to do service dot list, and the rest of this goes away. Right? And then I don't even need those. And the get by ID says the same thing. This is just underscore to do service dot get by ID. ID probably should have an await on it. Right? And then this one is just create. And this is var to do item equals to do service dot create item. And then this is just that. Alright. That should build. Okay, so that's not bad, right? We clean this up, we get rid of this repository from the controller. We say everything's in the service. Okay, so this is where most folks that don't do domain events, don't do domain-driven design, this is where they end up, right? But it's totally procedural, and it leads you to having a very anemic domain model. What does it mean to have an anemic domain model? Basically, it's just a DTO, right? It's just a bunch of properties. So this thing has no behavior on it whatsoever. It's not following object-oriented design, which says that we should encapsulate state and behavior together. Why doesn't it have any behavior? Well, because there's business logic that should occur whenever isDone is called and set to true that says we want to send this email. We don't have it in the entity. The only place we have it is in our some domain. No, that's not right. Is in the service, and the service is still sitting in the controller file in this to-do service, right? So when we call mark complete through the service, we get the correct behavior. But there's nothing. Hey, it's Brian Lagunas. How's it going? There's nothing that is compelling anyone to use this service, right? Anywhere in our system, if we want, we can grab a to-do item and we can call mark complete on it, and everything works just fine. In fact, when you have some new developer join the team and they're working in some other part of the system, they're not going to necessarily know that this service is the thing that you're supposed to call to do this work, right? They might just decide to get access to that item through some other mechanism, right? Like we don't have it right now, but let's say to-do item, you know, isn't the only thing in our model, right? Let's say later on we have this public class. We'll say it's a member, right? A member of our system has a public list of to-do items, right? And that has a getter and a private setter, let's say, and equals a new list of things, right? And so you could easily just say, hey, give me this member with their list of items, and you know, grab the first one and call isDone equals true. There's nothing stopping anybody from doing that. And if they do that, well, then they just bypassed your business rule that said anytime that happens, there should be a notification. Okay, so that's bad, right? Because this thing has No encapsulation. There's no way to enforce that rule except for code reviews and a lot of diligence for people to watch out that someone doesn't accidentally do the wrong thing somewhere down the road. We don't need to do all that. We have code that can do that for us, right? We can make sure that this thing is locked down, and the only way to change it is the way we want. The first thing we could do, the first thing that would make this better, is if we just made this internal. All right, let's just make that internal and see what that does for us. So now we can build, and we get, oh, I can't call isDone from here, right? Because this is in the web project, and internal is only going to let me do that from the core project. So at least that restricts access to that to where my domain logic should live. But that's pretty easy to change, right? Because I can just take this whole class, and I can come over here. Well, let me grab the class. I can take this whole class and copy it, or even cut it. Come over here and paste it in there. And it's going to have a few issues, right? Like these iRepositories are going to work just fine, but those to-do item DTOs are not. So we'll have to fix that. But once I've added some namespaces here, this move will be pretty straightforward. Let's put it in its own file while we're at it. Alright, so now we have to-do service right here, and everything's happy except still doesn't like link, still doesn't know about IEnumerable, and then the big one that I can't easily do is this to-do item DTO. So that's a problem that I'll have to solve if I wanted to do this. But what this does is it lets me call this line, right? Because I'm in the same project. So now I can at least make it so that some random schmo in the web project can't just go off and set isDone on to-do item. They've got to do it inside core. Thanks for the following, Tail Learn Code and Ona Maris. Appreciate it. Okay, so that's better, right? Most teams never use the internal keyword, but this is one place where it would be helpful. Now, what do I do about this to-do item DTO? The easiest thing is I just move it up into core, right? I don't necessarily always recommend that, but let's just do that this time to make life easier. So we're going to take this API model to-do item DTO. It doesn't have anything that really should restrict it from going in core. It doesn't know anything about web stuff, for example. We'll clean up its namespaces here to make that obvious, right? It only knows about data annotations and has its reference to entities because of this factory method that it supports. So if we just take this, and I'm not even going to cut it, I'm going to rename it here and copy it. So by renaming it, I'm going to make it so nothing that referenced it before will find that version of it, because I may want to go back here in a minute. And usually I'd create like a DTOs folder or something if I were going this route, but let's just drop it right in the root here. We'll add a new class to do item DTO. Alright, there it is. We'll paste this in. We get rid of the 2. And now, if we build, we should be pretty close to good. What kind of stream doesn't have a battle royale? One that has good content? Oh, burn. Alright, let's fix up a couple more things. We can install annotations. That's not going to hurt anything, so we'll install that. And then this needs a using statement. We'll install that. Alright, but with that now, we can go back to our domain service, which is in here, this to-do service. And look, everything's blue. Right? Everything's happy. We can build it, and we can add some more namespaces here so it can find that thing. Yeah, I don't care about this. Just go away. Yeah, nothing's calling that. Oh, you still need a namespace. Alright, now we're good. Right? Right? No, still no. Hold on. What is this? Oh, because you're like totally hard coding. How about we just change that to core? And you'll be happy. That's in a view somewhere. I gotta fix the view. Index CSHTML view. Alright, fine. To do here. I get rid of that. I'm gonna make that core. I'm just doing this to prove a point, but I'm having to fix all these references. Because this is all code we're not going to keep. Thanks for the follow, Icarus HQ. Cool name. Alright, so now everything builds, right? And as I already said, if it builds, that means it must work. Okay, so let's go back to our controller. What's our controller look like? Our controller is actually nice, right? We got rid of all these using statements we didn't need. Clean all that up. We look at the size of it. It's only this big, right? It's only 48 lines of code. And every single one is just call a service, call a service, call a service, all right? So that part's good. That part I like. And this is, ostensibly better than working with the repository directly in many cases. So those of you that are like, oh, whew, thanks, I'm glad Steve agrees with me. But I am fine with the old version with the repository if you're not really doing anything complicated. And in my case, I wasn't, right? In my case, I really was just doing CRUD operations. And then in complete, I was working with the item. So if you're not really doing DTO, then I would encourage you to go this route, right? Use a service, delegate everything to it, or as we already talked about, use Mediator or use API endpoints, and it would look like this instead, right? And your list would just be, that the stuff that would have been in that service would just be right here, right? It's just in your endpoint. There's nothing else going on here. This doesn't violate single responsibility principle. There's only, there's only this code right here. It's got one dependency. It's doing one thing. So it's pretty focused from my opinion. Okay. So let me come back to what's wrong with this still. I could still mark items complete from other places inside of core, right? I still don't have any real encapsulation here that prevents anyone else from setting that, and I have to do it through the service. The other thing that's bad about this, in my opinion, is let's say that there was some funky logic on here, like I don't know, public int, we'll say difficulty, that returns some fancy logic, return description dot length, right? Obviously, the difficulty of the task is directly proportional to how long of a description you type in. Okay, so now there's some logic on here. Okay? And I can ignore Surly Dev's ribbing of Brian Lagunas. That's fine. Hey, Simon Jeering. Okay. So what we're doing here, and I don't know why we added cryptography, that can go away, is we're adding some behavior to our entity, which is good. But what does that do at the controller and other levels, right? If I'm in this to-do item controller, and I get back this result, which is actually an item. So let's just make that clear, and we'll rename this item. Okay, so now if I want to do something with the difficulty, var difficulty equals item dot difficulty, right? So now I've got two different ways that I work with this item, right? I call the service to mark things complete, but I call the item to do stuff with its difficulty. And it's confusing, right? It's bad for me to have to think about two different places to go and do things. I'm going to go and I'm going to fetch an item from a repository. I'm going to be like, okay, I've got the item. I can now do mark complete, right? It's like, no, that's not there. Well, I can just say it's done, right? Right? Is that going to work? No, that's going to fail too because it's inaccessible. So then I got to go find the service to do the thing. But once I've got the service, now I'm like, okay, great. Everything's in the service. Do service.difficulty. No, it's not there, right? And so it's just confusing and jarring, and it's not a good design. It's not good API design, not your web API, but your domain model API, for you to have all this stuff in two different places, right? Your clients, the developers that are writing code here in the controller level, or in other services, aren't going to be happy with that, right? And so what they're going to do eventually is they're going to just follow down that road of making things consistent, right? We just did that here. We said, I don't like the inconsistency of having a repository for some things and a service for others. Well, now it's, I don't like the inconsistency of using methods on the item for some things and the service for others. So what are you going to do? Well, they're going to move difficulty to the service, of course. So they're going to say, this thing, that's too much of a pain. I don't want to have to call it from two places. Let me go to the service. We'll just add it there. And I just killed it. Oops. Cut. There we go. Paste. right? We'll put it there. We'll call it something like, calculate difficulty on a to-do item, and then this is just return item dot, right? It's already 3:30 in the morning in Sydney. All right, well, you should probably go to bed. Good night, Nibro. Thanks for watching. Okay, so you're going to do this, right? People do this all the time. I know, I've seen the code bases. And so what is this doing? Well, a couple things. One, it's making the service get bigger and bigger, and it's making this stay smaller and smaller, right? Now I have to call to do service dot calculate difficulty on the item, right? And that's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not a rich domain model. It's not a DDD model. It's not even an object-oriented design model following object-oriented principles because, again, we're not encapsulating anything, right? This to-do item entity is just a DTO. Why do we even have this entity? Why don't I just use the DTO, right? It's got the same stuff. There's no difference. And the whole thing I'm supposed to have on that entity is behavior. I'm supposed to be able to add encapsulation. I'm supposed to be able to force all this stuff to happen and make sure that the only way to do this thing, the only place they have to enforce this invariant or make sure this business rule happens is in here. And so that's where I can go one step further than internal. I can say, no, we're going to make this private. All right, we're going to say the only place that you can mark this thing complete is here. We're going to say public void mark complete right on this thing, and we're going to say is done equals true, right? And we're going to do it right there. Now, if we make that private and we build, our service is not going to be very happy, right? Service is going to be unhappy that that no longer works. And so I can't call it complete from the service, which is sad. Now, I could call to-do-item.mark complete, and that's fine. But now my business rule, and it doesn't equal true, it's a method. But now my business rule here is still in the service, right? So that's not great. I want to put this inside the to-do item as well. So let's pull that out of there. And let's go into to-do item. And let's make sure that we send that email. All right, now what's wrong with this? Anybody? Nothing wrong with stateless services containing all the behavior and pure functions and just using DTOs for passing state about. It works for some systems. It's a functional approach. It's not an object-oriented programming approach, right? You can use it. It'll work great with things like Azure Functions. It works great with like F#. But it doesn't do a good job of encapsulating your domain model, right? And making sure that these rules can't be bypassed. So you can have a lot more confidence in your system working correctly if you have encapsulation of your logic in your domain model and tests that prove that it works, right? Whereas if you have just a bunch of DTOs that anybody can set to anything and a bunch of services that can do whatever the hell they want, then it's a lot harder for you to be confident that there isn't some service somewhere that's doing the wrong thing, right? No return, in my opinion, since we're performing cross-boundary operations regarding send email. No return type. I'm not sure I follow that one, Adza. JF Stern says the entity has to take on a dependency on the email service. Bingo. To-do items shouldn't be responsible for sending email. Probably also true. It does indeed get very functional very quickly, yes. And one of the things functional languages have is immutable types, which we don't have here. And so we can't be certain that this entity hasn't changed in between services. So it's tougher. And Naved also says domain class will be responsible for sending email. Right. All good points. Right. Now, I'm okay with the fact that the domain class is the thing that is responsible for making sure that emails get sent in the abstract. Right. It doesn't have to know about the details of how to do it, but it would be okay for it to know about it in the abstract. So this dependency, though, is a problem. I can't use dependency injection in an entity because entity framework doesn't know what to do with that. Right? If I come up here and I say create a constructor and pass in, this email sender, email sender, right? I can write the code. The code's going to work fine at compile time. Right? That's all great code. Good job. It builds, so ship it. Doesn't build, but it could build. But here I can't even seed my database. All my seed methods blow up because they don't have that thing. And you're going to have the same problem when AEF tries to call it. So I'll save the time of showing you that it doesn't work because you all know it doesn't work, and we'll just get rid of this. And we'll say, okay, well, what are our options then? I want the domain class to encapsulate the rule that says the only place I can mark this complete is right here. The entire system can't do it anywhere but here. It's my single route through which all marking of complete of to-do items takes place. And I want to make sure that emails get sent when that happens. So one thing you can do is you can come into my email service over here, let's say, and we'll just add another method here that looks very similar to the first one. Like that. Bam. And then I can go into my entity. And there's one problem with this, which is that I put that inside infrastructure. But I could then just make this a capital email sender.send email. And that's a static, and it would just work. Now the reason it doesn't work is because this is an infrastructure and I don't have a dependency on it. But I could put this somewhere else. I could put it, wherever. It just has to hang off of some type somewhere. So, there. And call that, right? So as soon as you make this static, it just works. Right? What's wrong with making it static? Anybody? Let's say I create this utilities class somewhere. Right? We'll call this public. Who has a utilities class? Public class utils. Of course that's what we're going to name it, because that's what those things are called. And we'll come in here and we'll take this static off of this. And we'll call it utils dot. And where did I put it? Oh, there it is. Paste that in. Put it in its own class. Alright. Can't mock it for testing. Testability. Boom. Exactly. You're all correct. So you come over here and you say, I want to test that this thing works with a unit test. I can easily just new this thing up and I can call mark complete and I can verify, assert, is done is true when I'm done. Except that this thing blows up every time because there's not an email service. Or worse, it actually sends emails. So yeah, that's not good. So I don't want to call it statically. Okay, that's fine. Let's not use utils. That was a bad idea. Let's say I want to call this send email code through the interface. Right? I created this email sender for a reason. What if I put it on here? Right? So I email sender right there, and then we say here. Email sender send email. That builds. That works. What's wrong with that? Yeah, I don't need utils anymore. I'm just going to delete that. Alright, so here's the new mark complete. We're just going to pass in the thing we need right into the method. And Naved says it won't be future-proof. What if tomorrow there's a need to send push notifications when a to-do item is marked as complete? Yeah, with statics you don't have the ability to plug and play and swap out. With an interface you do. With an interface, I maybe named it poorly because I called it email sender, but I could have called it iNotification or iUpdater or something, and then I could have used a push notification or a text or whatever. Okay. What's wrong with just passing the dependency into the method? Nobody? Nobody? The problem is that you're just kicking the can down the road, right? And you're making it so anything that calls this thing has to have this dependency. And where are they going to get it from? Well, they probably can't just new it up, right? They need to ask for it from their controller or their constructor. All right, so if I was just saying, take this item, let's pretend this is a repository, right? And I just want to call item.markComplete. Boom. Well, I can't now, right? Because now I need to pass it this email sender. Well, I don't have an email sender. So what do? Now I've got to ask for an email sender from my constructor. And I don't even need an email sender. The only reason I'm getting it is so I can pass it to somebody else. So that's horrible. And if you follow that, even just a couple steps, your constructors get out of control quickly, because every single one of these methods might have this or that dependency that they need, and all of them flow up into this constructor right here, and this thing just gets massive, right? Because it needs to know everything about every dependency that every child might have. And it's not my job to know about this dependency that Mark Complete has, right? That's not a thing I should care about. So that's not good. Okay, so what we would really like would be for us to be able to just call Mark Complete, have that be the only place where this is done is true thing happens, and also the only place where we send emails. And that's where, circling back, that's where these domain events come in. All right, so I can say events.add, I'm queuing this thing up, new item completed event with this item right there. All right, and now what that does is it makes it so I don't have to do this work somewhere else, right? Now I could still use a service if I wanted to. So since I've got the controllers all been lobotomized to use a service, let's go look at that. To do service. Now, instead of doing the email, yeah, this just works as is, right? When I call to do item.mark complete, the email gets sent. And why does the email get sent? Well, because of that event handler. When I call this update async, it will trigger dispatching that event, and this handler will be called and it will do the email. Now it won't yet because I didn't wire it up, but let's do it. Let's go in here and let's say I have an email sender, right? And then in here, instead of do nothing, this would be an async email sender if I'd done that correctly, but forgive me. It's an email, and this would be whatever I've been doing, to from subject body. Actually, let's make this one $, the item domain event dot completed item dot title was completed. Bam. Alright, so we can build that, and let's actually see if this works. So let's go in here. Are you broken or not? Oh, I don't have an email sender for that. For handler equals new. Do I need it? Yeah, it doesn't matter. I can pass it null. And pass this null. Okay, this does nothing given event instance. Well, that's not going to work. I'm just going to comment that one out, because now it does something and actually tries to send an email. Alright, boom. Let's not do IIS-Express. Let's build it with Kestrel so we can see the log output easily. And run it. Alright, so now we're running. Let's go into Swagger. Let's look at the items. Let's do a list. Well, Nads, I'll get to your question in 1 second. Let's try this out. Execute. I want to see which ones of these still work. Okay, so I don't have a to-do service wired up, so that's one thing I got to do. So let's do that. So I think I'm just in that controller. I'm not even looking for an interface. Right? I'm just using to-do service. So I just need to go into startup and go configure services, blah 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 blah, and we'll just add the service directly here. Services.add transient of to-do service, like that. Now it knows about it. Let's run it again. Go into Swagger. We're going to get another one of those errors in a minute, probably. To-do items, we want to list them. We're going to try it out. We're going to execute. And now we get another similar error. While doing to-do service, none of the constructors found on to-do service can be invoked because I don't know what to do with IEmailSender, right? So that's what I meant when I said we're going to get another one of those. So we come over here and we do the same thing with IEmailSender, which is going to be email sender, like that, and run it one more time. If we can get to the point where we can do the list, then we'll be in good shape. So there's this list, that one works. Let's do this list, and get, and try it, and execute, and we're happy again. And this one's true, and this one's true, and this one's false. So we want to do number 3. So now we're going to say, alright, let's complete number 3. Now let's look at that code one more time before we run it. In the controller, we're going to call the to-do service to call mark complete on this entity. So then we're going to go to the to-do service. We're going to go to this, I guess it's at the top, this mark complete right here. It's going to fetch the item, call mark complete, save it. All right. And that's all that's going to happen, right? So we come over here, we hit patch, we say try it out on ID number 3, and when I execute that, I should get my log message here if I did all this right. So we execute that, and there's our log message. Sending email to 2 from with subject, the item blah 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 was complete. So it all works, all right? Okay, so now let's go back to the questions that we have. Passing the dependency into the method is a good option for legacy code where you can't do DI due to constructor side effects. Yes, certainly. It's a good hack. It's not ideal, but sometimes it's useful. Wanadza says, one question, Steve. What is the strategy to perform unit testing if we have event-driven technique in our code? Things like making sure the event is executed. Well, whose job is that? All right. Let's talk about that for a second. So, how am I going to unit test to do item.mark complete? What unit test do I need for that? Well, it turns out I have unit tests, so you can see what those look like. If I come down here and we look at what should to do item mark complete do, I think these can come back now. I'm going to say it should be setting is done to true, and it should be raising an event. That's literally all it does, right? So if we look at to do item, right, that's what I want to test. That's all I want to test. I don't need to test that it sends an email. That's not its job, right? Sending the email is someone else's job. Now, if I want to make sure that the whole controller works and that the email gets sent, I'll write a functional test for that, right? That's a different thing, right? I can write a functional test for, I don't have one of those here, it looks like. I've got a list. But I would have an API to do items controller mark complete test here, and it would call /API/complete with a patch, and I would verify that that the message was sent. I probably wouldn't verify that I actually sent an email, but I'd verify that a message that would turn into an email was queued up to do. Right? And that would be not too difficult to do here. What if you don't want to send an email in some cases? Would you pass another boolean from the domain entity and the event handler will decide based on logic? Yeah, my event that I'm handling can have whatever I want in it. Right? So this is my to-do item completed event. It includes, at the moment, just the item. The logic for whether or not to send an email probably could live in the handler and probably is based on this item. But if it's not, I could add additional logic, right? Maybe I want to set that inside of the entity itself. Well, I could have a thing here that says public bool, send notification, get set. These things don't need to have any encapsulation, right? This event, this is just a DTO. So it has no behavior. It's just a bunch of state. You can totally just have gets and sets on it and never have to worry about making them private or any of that. It's only your entities that have behavior that require encapsulation. But now with this, on this message, on this event, in here, I could say if, something, then, and let's move this up, var my event equals this. That, and say if true, then my event dot send notification equals true, and then send my event, right? And then inside my handler, I have access to that, and I could say if domain event dot send notification, then do this work, right? So that's how you could do that. All right, well now I just got that. Cool. Boker 2Man, he was asking that. Hopefully he's got that. All right. You could inject an email sender that doesn't send an email. Yes, that's another option. Ninja Bob says, you could change this to not actually send emails, but I don't think that's what he's asking. I think he wants to send emails sometimes and not others, in which case you probably want to have some conditional logic in here, perhaps. There are ways to do it so that you would actually invoke a different handler based on that, and usually that would be subclassing the events or using different events, right? So you might have a to-do item completed event that you fire when you want to send email notifications. You might have a different completed event that you fire when you don't, right? And they could subclass from one another or whatever if you wanted. And then based on whichever one of those you raised, the appropriate handler would be called, right? Because these are strongly typed. And so this one will only be called for this event. It wouldn't be called for, a different event that was, a different type, right? Thanks for following. Heiko Panjas. Probably screwing up your name. Any reason you did add transient instead of scope? No, not really. It doesn't really matter in this case which one. Honestly, it could have been a singleton too if I wanted to. I'm pretty sure. So yeah, any of those lifetimes would work in this case. Tony Davis, thank you. Hey, look, there's my solid course you could learn. Bokerman says, good. You're welcome. RIP.net, what email sender service do you use? I usually use SendGrid. When I'm doing testing like this for like a class or something, I'll use a local SMTP service, like SMTP for Dev, or there's one that I'm going to blog about soon. I keep forgetting. But literally, I have a to-do list item right here to blog it. I want to show it to you real quick. No. Where is it? Alright, I've lost it. Oh, you know what I did? I think I put it in my drafts of my blog. Let me find it there. Posts, drafts. Nope, it's not there either. Alright, I've lost it. This is why I need to blog it, because I can't find it ever otherwise. But you can run a test email server in a Docker container really easily, which I showed on my stream a couple weeks ago. And now I've lost it again. Nope, there it is. Found it. Got it. Alright, hang on. This. So, boom. This thing is an email server you can run locally. And if you take this, and this will probably be in my blog sooner rather than later because I keep forgetting it. You come in here and you run this there. Container is already... What? Is it already running? Alright, maybe I left it running from last time I did it. But then you could come into my email sender, which currently isn't doing anything, right? Here, it's just logging. But we could use a local SMTP server. So var email client equals new SMTP client with localhost, and then var message equal new system.net.mail message mail mess. What is it? Mail message. It is mail message. Give me IntelliSense. Like that. And then this has 2 equals 2, from equals from. This wants to be an actual mail address collection. New list of, it's really annoying. I think there's an add method to do it. We'll do it after. From equals from. Is that any better? Mail address. Alright, fine. New mail address. This thing is annoying to do from scratch. That looks good. Subject equals subject. Body equals body. Those ones I think just work. Alright, do that. Message dot add. To.add. There we go. New mail address to. Finally. And then we can say email client.send message. Alright. So with all of that in place, if we try to actually send this email, it should work. Hi from Minsk. Hey, welcome. What do you think about storing files in SquidX? I don't know SquidX. Sorry. Have not used it. Alright, so if I've got all this and I'm using just local, and this should have a using statement wrapped around it and be better code, but what this will do if we run it and we actually hit this email sender, which I believe we are currently. So let's run. Let's go to Swagger and just mark something complete. There's too many of these running? What's the problem here? Unable to do the web server. Alright. Try again. There we go. Bring this back over here. There we go. Let's go mark complete. Try it out. Number 1, execute. And here, specified string is not in the form of an email address. Alright, fine. Wants me to actually do email addresses. Let's see, sending, where did I do the to and the from? That was in the handler. So here's my handler. I'm going to send this to foo@bar.com from bar@baz.com. Build that. Get rid of that. Try it one more time. We're about out of time for today. There we go. Come in here, try it out. Number 1, execute. And now, failure sending mail, no connection can be made. Alright, so I'm not listening on port 25. So I gotta figure out why this thing didn't work. So here's my Docker stuff. And it says, a container named Papercut is already in use by this container. Alright, I'll just give it another name. Papercut 2. Will that work? Yeah, that works. Alright, good enough. So now let's come over here, let's try this again. Execute. Now it works right away. Okay. So then this thing is listening on port 37408. So over here, we're going to go to localhost 37408. And here's Papercut running. And look, the item get sample working was completed. And that was sent from bar@baz to foo@bar right now. So this is what you can do for testing email locally if you want, is one option. So that's one I wanted to show. Hey Ardalis, thanks for adding my project link to your repo. You bet. Would love it if you would return the favor and link back to mine. Let people see them both and figure out which one they like better. Okay, so that's that. And I didn't get anything done with my actual project coding, but that's alright. This was fun. What about strategy pattern for different behaviors instead of a Boolean flag? Certainly. So the way I would probably trigger that would be by raising different events, typically. Like the challenge with the strategy pattern is you've got to know which implementation to pass in. Alright. Hey, can you show that logic behind events.add events? Yeah, I totally have time because there's nothing to it. But I'll show you more than just that because I think that's what you're going to want to see. So here is the base events property, right? And all this stuff is in my clean architecture GitHub repo, so you can grab it and play with it there. But it's literally just a list. It's not even a property, right? It's just a field that is a list, and it's on the base entity. So to do item has access to that because the base entity. So when it's going to events, this is on the base type, base entity.events, and it just adds it. The magic, the part you want to see, Karmic G, is actually inside of infrastructure in the AppDB context. And so that's where I overload save changes async, and I went through this earlier. But basically I go and find all the events, all the entities that have events, and then I get all the events off those entities, and then I dispatch them. And there's a dispatcher in here that does the work of doing it. And there's a bunch of code in here that uses a AutoFat container to find the handlers that you don't have to worry about, right? It does the work. But that's where the magic happens, right? So when you save changes, it triggers those. Now, this is just one type of domain event. We spent 2 hours talking about this, and I've only covered one of them. I would recommend that you go out to my podcast and look for domain events. And this Google search will work just fine. So here's this Google search for you. And what that will do is it will show you the difference between domain events that fire off before persistence, which we haven't talked about at all today, and domain events that fire after persistence, which is what this sample uses. The event dispatcher is in your DB context. That sounds like two separate concerns, persisting data and executing business logic. It's not in it, it's referenced from it, right? It's a dependency. So it gets injected using dependency injection strategy pattern, and it just delegates to it, and the dispatcher does the work. So the dispatcher is its own separate thing, implements its own separate interface. This particular one uses AutoFac, so you can see up here, because I'm using AutoFac in this sample. If you weren't using AutoFac, you could just implement this separately, or you could have different ones and you could toggle between them. But yeah, you're right. AppDB context should not directly be responsible for managing events. That's why it delegates that to the dispatcher. There's probably some way I could take this logic too and pull it into the dispatcher or pull it into some other service. But this is very heavily Entity Framework code, at least this part, right? The fact that it's dealing with the change tracker. Maybe once I get from here, maybe once I get to this loop, I could pull that out. But at that point, it's not really moving that much code. Do you dispatch inside or outside of the transaction? Outside. So the transaction has occurred, the database has been saved, and then if I have a dispatcher, you could just pass it null. If I have a dispatcher, then I dispatch the events. Would you use AMQ or Kafka or something similar in a real-world microservices architecture? Perhaps. Or Azure Service Bus or any number of message-based systems, certainly. These domain events are in process, right? These are in this particular application. So there's no out-of-process stuff happening here. And that's okay, right? This is meant to be in-memory, in-process, unit-testable messages and events that we're talking about. If I wanted to integrate with Kafka or AMQ or Azure Service Bus or whatever, that would happen here, right? I would have this handler, and then instead of an email sender, I would have an Azure client or a Kafka client or something like that, and I would put a message on the bus or in the queue or whatever here, and that would be where I would translate from a domain event, which is defined just inside my domain model, to an integration event or a cross-domain event, which is the message that's going to go on the bus that other systems might read. So as soon as you start talking about like a microservices architecture or distributed architecture, where there's events going over the wire, those are not domain events. Those are something else, right? I usually call them integration events. And if you want to read more about integration events and how those work, you can look at the eShop on Containers sample and the book that goes with it. If you just Google for this is the companion to my sample, which is the eShop on Web sample. So I'll throw them both up here. And both of them have ebooks with them. So mine talks about how to build a monolithic application where everything is in one app domain and gets deployed as a unit. eShop on Containers is much more complicated, but it's where you would see more of a full microservices architecture. And like this, right? This is what the architecture looks like for eShop on Containers, with all these different microservices and this event bus on the back, right? And so these messages that are going on that event bus, those are not domain events. Those are integration events. How would you trigger the events if instead of accessing to the database, you had a call to a service to mark to-do item as complete? That would probably be, well, what are you going to do with that entity at that point? Are you never going to save it? If you're going to save it, then I would want to make sure that I saved it before I would fire off the event that would trigger these external operations. If it's something I don't care about, if it doesn't have any external side effects, but I want the event to still fire, then that would be a before persistence event. And there's different patterns for that. So you can use Mediator, or you could use Udi Dahan's got a nice thing that's been around for over a decade now. If you look for Udi Dahan, domain event salvation, it's called. There's this sample here that you can literally just copy paste, and it mostly still works. His uses structure map. You'd have to change it if you're not using structure map anymore. But the code looks like this right here. And it's just a static. Right? So inside of mark complete, you would call domain events dot raise, and then you would pass it in the domain event you were passing it, the event completed event. And then that would trigger it immediately, right at that line of code, it would trigger it. So there's no dispatcher at that point. That's just like right there at that moment, it's calling out. This is the equivalent to if you were using Mediator, saying mediator.send, right? And right there at that moment, it sends the thing, either synchronously or asynchronously, but that thread of execution is going off and calling the handler right then. Does that make sense? Whereas with the post persistence events, we are not firing them off immediately. We're just queuing them up. We're creating a list of them. And then when we have saved, then we dispatch them after we're done with persistence. All right, so I am over time. And I've got some other stuff I got to get done today, but thank you all for coming and for the great conversation. Hopefully this was useful. Feel free to follow /subscribe / tell your friends about my stuff. Watch my Pluralsight courses. That's always helpful. And let's go find who we can raid real quick so that somebody else can get the benefit of your company. So twitch.tv, let's go there, go dashboard, and see who's around. Oh, let's go back to good old. Well, no, let's go to CodeRush. We'll see what Mark Miller's working on. So we're gonna send you over to Mark Miller's stream. He's always working on cool stuff, usually in .NET as well. Yep, Surly Dev. That's where I'm thinking. And we'll just do that, and then I'll see you over there for a minute and see what he's doing. So he's got like 11 people, and I'm gonna send him like 36 people. So at least hang out for like a minute, just so he sees that there's a ton of people coming. All right, I'll see you there in a minute.
Old charges remaining. What's going on with old charges remaining?